Hello, this is Angela, one of the hosts of Journeys of Hope, and I'm standing here on the grounds of Pilgrim Center of Hope. Guiding people on journeys of hope is our passion, and as a nonprofit organization, we couldn't do it without you. Today, I'd like to thank our generous sponsor who made this podcast possible, in honor of Valentin, Nicholas, and Francisco Campos.
Journeys of Hope, an introduction to the Universal Church that promotes an attitude of pilgrimage among the faithful by introducing you to pilgrim destinations around the world. Welcome to Journeys of Hope, your passport to sacred destinations around the world. This new program, produced by the Pilgrim Center of Hope, provides you with a virtual pilgrimage to all the places associated with the history of our church and written about in Scripture. For the last 26 years, Pilgrim Center of Hope has led over 70 authentic spiritual pilgrimages to the Holy Land, Italy, France, Spain, Greece, Turkey, Germany, Marian apparition sites, and beyond. As a result, Journeys of Hope is able to take you to these holy sites so that you can experience what it is to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, the apostles, and the saints. Aside from transporting you to all these distant holy sites, we also like to take you on local pilgrimages to sacred destinations that played a major role in the establishment of the Catholic Church in the San Antonio area. I'm Robert Rodriguez. Thanks for being with us for this journey.
And I'm Angela Cialana, Media Coordinator for Pilgrim Center of Hope. Journeys of Hope is a co-production of Pilgrim Center of Hope and the Guadalupe Radio Network. Our programs are available on podcast and also on our website, pilgrimcenterofhope.org. So if you're new to the program, I encourage you to take a look at our Journeys of Hope archives, which contains all the previous episodes of this wonderful program. So this week we are very excited to look back on the 1987 visit of St. Pope John Paul II to San Antonio, Texas. The visit, which took place over a 22-hour period from September 13th through the 14th, remains the only time a pope has visited San Antonio. During this next hour, not only will we review that historic visit of John Paul, who is known as the Pilgrim Pope, to San Antonio, but we will also speak with the project manager for that historic visit, and we will talk about the papacy and legacy of St. John Paul II. So unity in this work of service was the theme for the 1987 visit of St. Pope John Paul II to San Antonio. This was a massive undertaking which involved the Vatican, the entire Texas province of Catholic dioceses, as well as the cooperation of federal, state, county, and city governments.
So certainly there had to be lots of coordination for this amazing 22 hours. And certainly it involved the Archdiocese, but there were also a few individuals that maybe others might not be familiar with. So we're going to, in a little while, be introducing the project manager for the visit. And what you're going to find is, as Mr. Aguirre, our guest, has mentioned in articles that have been written, that the visit showcased to the world the very best of Texas and San Antonio. We also saw the interfaith spirit of San Antonio on full display. And, most notable, we saw the involvement of Reverend Buckner Fanning from First Baptist Church and from Rabbis Samuel Stahl and David Jacobson of the Jewish community. So we definitely had a lot of spirit and unity as we looked at the collective efforts of all the parties involved. And here with us in studio today, the project manager for St. Pope John Paul II's visit to San Antonio. Here with us is Mr. Robert Aguirre, who today is president of Robert Aguirre Consultants, longtime San Antonio businessman, but back then in 1987, he was called upon by the Archdiocese to help coordinate this historic event. So, Mr. Aguirre, welcome to the studios, welcome to our program, and yes, I guess the first question would be, how did this all come about in terms of your being selected to be the project manager?
Well, that's a wonderful but long story. So the Cliff Note version of that story, Robert, would be that I had law enforcement experience and connections, and had worked with the Secret Service in the past. And when I heard the Pope was coming, I was determined that the bishops of Texas needed to hire someone to actually project manage the visit, to actually organize all of the physical aspects of it. And so I just became determined that I was going to be that person, and worked for several months to put together a prototype organizational plan for a papal visit, and just walked in the door of the diocese and said, I want to talk to somebody.
Wow. So that was the impetus and how it began. And so
it sounds like it was really a mission for you, a personal mission as well as a professional mission.
It was. I learned about it sitting in my living room on the 10 o'clock news one night, and I just knew from that moment on. In fact, I turned to my wife and I said, I'm going to manage the Pope's visit. And I just set about to doing it. There was never a doubt in my mind that it would happen.
Well, so with that kind of deep intention within you, or that feeling that you were that person, talk to me about how when you first met with Monsignor Steuben and Sister Charlene, or perhaps even Archbishop, then what did you sense from them as you conveyed your desire to want to coordinate that visit?
Well, it was a somewhat surreal chain of events that took place, that began with my having a one-on-one visit with Father David Garcia. That was the first person that, after sitting in the lobby waiting for hours, was the first person who agreed to see me. And so I met with him, and he asked me to leave all of my materials, because I had laid out a mass site design and had a location identified. And so he asked me to leave my materials, and then later he called me back, and I met with him again, went through the same thing again, just with him, and then he thanked me, and I left, and then some time went by, and then he asked me to come back, and this time I met with him and Father Steuben, Monsignor Steuben, and they thanked me, and I left, and a period of time went by, and then they asked me to come back again, and made the same presentation to the same two gentlemen, and they thanked me, and I left. And so one thing led to another. Eventually, they said that they liked what I had laid out, and they wanted me to be the project manager.
So you were properly vetted.
I suppose.
Well, in this 2017 article that you wrote, we had the privilege of reading before in preparation. It's called "A Bright Moment in San Antonio's History, a Saint Comes to Town." You described the Holy Father as a simple man, simple man of faith, and that you had met him several times. You had several opportunities to meet him. So kind of setting the tone for this program, could you tell us, so many people say, well, he gave off this aura, this bright presence of God. What was your experience of encountering John Paul II?
I would describe it as a indescribable joy and indescribable calmness. There was a whirlwind all around him, always. The things happening all around him. But at the center of that, he stood with perfect calmness. And when you stood next to him, you felt that calmness, or even near him, you felt that calmness. My job that day was to always move in front of him, to go through the doorway before he went through, go, into the vehicles before he did, and move ahead of him in the vehicles. I mean, I was always right there all day long throughout the day. And among the chaos and the issues that arose throughout the day, the thing that I remember the most is the joy and the peacefulness of being with him.
Well, let's get into that then, the visit itself. So John Paul II spent 22 hours, as we said, in San Antonio. He touched down at Kelly Air Force Base. which is now Port San Antonio. Was it officially called Shepherd One, the airplane?
The airplane. Yeah.
It was officially called Shepherd One, and it said so right on the side.
So what was the mood when that plane touched down?
It was one really of kind of disbelief. It was very hard to believe. I mean, there's this jet in front of us, and it says Shepherd One, and it was just hard to believe. The door opens up, and he comes out, and even at that moment, it was hard to believe. And it wasn't until he came down the steps and went through the receiving line with the governor and the county judge and the mayor. It still didn't seem real until he broke through the security ranks and went over to where the mariachis were playing. And then all of a sudden it became very, very, very real.
Wow.
And it was an extraordinary moment.
Well, that paints a great picture for us. There were 6 official events, so he was a very busy man, as you mentioned. But let's kind of remind our listeners what those 5 other events besides the Mass were. So he had lunch with the Texas bishops. He had a meeting with the seminarians and also women preparing for religious life at San Fernando Cathedral. He had the Catholic Charities USA meeting at Municipal Auditorium.
Now the Tobin Center for the Arts.
Mm-hmm. Right. And also an address to the Hispanic Catholic community at Plaza Guadalupe. One of the most beautiful things that I think is the way that he highlighted the Hispanic community when he was here in San Antonio. What was it that, he really... He brought that out in the Hispanic community being a part of this belief in family that we have in the U.S. What was it that you saw in him and his encounter with the Hispanic community here in San Antonio? Can you kind of paint a picture for us of what that was like in his demeanor and his encounter?
Well, the really interesting thing about John Paul II was that he was much more comfortable in the Hispanic community than in the English community. Much more comfortable. He was much more comfortable speaking Spanish than he was speaking English. So he was just right at home on the West Side. And that entire visit was conducted in Spanish. I mean, he gave his talk in Spanish. And we were fortunate to have quite a number of bishops from Mexico there, as well as the Texas bishops, and the Vatican ambassador, the United States ambassador to the Vatican also attended, Ambassador Shakespeare, and it was just an incredible visit that was filled with such a spirit. I guess because of its location on the West Side and I mean, he could see what the neighborhood looked like because he was in the Pope Mobile. So, he could see the neighborhood very, very well, both coming and going from that location. It was an extraordinary moment, and it was one that was unforgettable.
So, some of these, whether it was the lunch with the bishops, with the meeting with the seminarians and women religious and the Catholic Charities gathering, those, were kind of... I guess more official in comparison to the other gatherings. But when it comes to the gathering at Plaza Guadalupe or with bringing the Polish community from Panna Maria to meet with him at Assumption Seminary, who in fact decided to include those events? Did he have any input on that, or was that something that Archbishop Flores and the folks at the Archdiocese wanted?
The Texas bishops pushed very hard for the West Side event and really had no trouble getting that approved. When the Vatican Advance team came through in May of '87, and I walked them through the location and the visit, and that one was also unique because it really put the Holy Father very, very close to the crowd. I mean, he wasn't like way up on some stage somewhere, and so it put him very close to the public. But the Vatican we didn't have to talk them into it. It was a done deal. The visit with the Polish community was a little bit more difficult.
So tell us about
to get approved.
Oh, well, tell us about that gathering, because certainly I would think that his heart would have just welled up with joy to be among the Polish community here.
Well, you would think, but it was very difficult up until even the day of the event. It was very difficult to get the Vatican to go along with that last event of the evening, and their reason was that it would have been a long day. He's going to be very tired.
Yes.
The heat, all true, all understandable. But we really had to fight to keep the Polish visit in the agenda. Even up until that very night of the event.
And what was the highlight of that encounter? So he was, it was at Assumption Seminary?
It was on the grounds of Assumption Seminary.
And it was the community from Panna Maria, Texas.
Other communities as well, but basically the Panna Marian community is being the oldest Polish church.
So what happened?
Well, he spoke in Polish, and then he broke impromptu into a Polish song, and everybody joined in, and then he walked down from the small stage that we had erected, and started working the crowd.
Wow!
And of course, because he did that, it went much later than it was supposed to have gone. So it even made for a much longer day. But it was a wonderful event with a crowd of shared culture.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of the long day, and I mean, he was at that time 67 years old.
That's right.
I remember hearing, I don't know that we got to see it, because I can recall that out in front of Assumption Seminary, or there on the grounds of the Archdiocese, there were like tents covering vehicle as it came in, and as to when he would exit the vehicle or enter into Assumption Seminary. But somewhere along the line, did he not take a brief rest or a nap or some kind of
he did.
break to re-energize?
After he had lunch with the Texas bishops, from the Mass, we came to Assumption, had lunch with the Texas bishops, and then he had a short rest period after that. And that was the only rest period he had at the end of the day. And I'll point this out because I think this is really interesting and telling about the Holy Father, is that at the end of that long day with all of those people and all that heat and all that moving around, at the end of the day when we walked back into the apartment there at Assumption Seminary, Rosemary Kowalski had prepared his dinner, because he hadn't eaten, and had prepared his dinner, which he I was going to say he refused. He didn't really refuse it, but he said that really all he wanted was an apple.
Wow.
For dinner. And of course, with our luck, an apple was not to be found. So we had to go through great lengths to come up with an apple. But that's all he had at the end of that long day.
Wow.
It's quite extraordinary.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, of course, was the heat. And we've been going a bit backwards, but I think it's because, that Mass was just so, was really the highlight, I think, for everyone
Sure,
in the
focal
city.
point, and of course, as we read in whether your article or so many articles that have been put out there, how over 350,000 people
Yes.
gathered, still the largest gathering of people in Texas in our history. But yeah, so being that was kind of the big event where the majority of San Antonio got to all be in one place with him, why don't we now get into talking about the Mass at Westover Hills, from picking that site to then preparing the site and the things that happened along the way leading up to the Mass, because there really was a miraculous event in there prior to the Mass. So if you can speak to the preparations leading up to the Mass, and then, of course, the Mass itself.
Well, of course, the big immediate challenge when I came on board was to solidify a location for the outdoor Mass, since that being the biggest event of the visit. And so the initial location that I had identified didn't work out for various reasons, so I had to get to work to find a different location. And I found this location in Westover Hills, and as I researched who owned the property, I loved the idea that it was owned by three men, one a Baptist, one a Jew, and one a Catholic. And I said, what could be more perfect than this?
Exactly.
So in approaching them, they immediately said yes, and we got to work on the Mass site. So, there are a lot of logistics, a lot of issues dealing with that, and all that. It was important. It was mostly revolving around security for the Holy Father and the health and safety of the people, the pilgrims who were in attendance. And so the idea was that this wasn't an event, this was a pilgrimage. And so it was pilgrims coming to see the successor to Peter, Christ's representative. And so it was for much more than just Catholics. It was for all the community. So we kept that in mind from the very beginning and the way the site was designed and laid out and how we went about preparing it. And so it worked very well as an outdoor cathedral, if I could call it a cathedral. It ended up working quite well. One little quick anecdote that I'll tell you that happened to Sister Charlene as people were leaving. A lady came up to Sister Charlene as the crowd was making the exit, and she says, "Look at this." She says, "Look how everybody looks so happy and so peaceful, and everybody's helping everybody else." She says, "This must be what heaven is like."
That's an interesting observation that you make, because another thing that you provided for us as we're preparing for the show was an article from an anonymous papal usher, and that seems to be the theme of that piece that he wrote of all the unity that he saw and just the joy and people serving each other's needs. And interestingly enough, I got to be a papal usher through Holy Spirit Parish. So I can recall, yes, certainly. It was my great pleasure and a memory for me that lives on. But I can recall getting there, maybe not as early as the gentleman who wrote the article, because he got there someplace, 1 or 2 in the morning. But I got there still before the sun had come up, and can recall hearing the choirs and the music over the sound system. And,
right.
So Sister Charlene, this is what heaven is like, but it made me imagine what it might have been like to be out, whether the Mount of Beatitudes or some other place in the Holy Land, hearing our Lord speak when he would get up and speak to the crowds outside in these open spaces. That's really the sense that I got from being there.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. One of the things that when we say, well, what did it all mean in retrospect? One of the stories that I love to tell was the story of the commemoration ceremony that we had at the Mass site to celebrate the 25th anniversary. So 25 years after the Holy Father's visit. So we had a nice ceremony out there, and there were maybe 100 people. And so I got up, I said a few words, I was asked to say a few words, and I noticed that there was a man standing in the back wearing the gold papal usher cap and wearing the gold sash. And he caught my eye. He was an elderly gentleman standing by himself. Afterwards, I made it a point to go over and to thank him for coming. And he said, "Oh, I would not have missed this for the world. The Holy Father's visit absolutely changed my life." And I said, "Well, that's really wonderful." I said, "What parish do you belong to?" And he says, "Oh, I'm not Catholic." He says, "But I would not have missed this for the world," he said, "because it saved me."
Wow.
And I thought, wow, what was the impact of the Holy Father's visit? This man was an usher, but he was certainly a pilgrim.
Well, he was so much known for, bringing people together and thinking globally and wanting to reach out, to people wherever they were at, and that whole message that he gave about coming back to reconciliation.
Yes.
Don't be afraid. Our Lord is here, waiting for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved what he said about reconciliation in his homily at the Mass. It was just beautiful.
Well, and as the article from our anonymous usher mentions, that Archbishop Flores was beaming, right, the whole time, I would imagine, as he's observing all of this.
He was beaming. He had such an extraordinary talent of just always being able to remain himself, no matter what was happening. He was just such a wonderful, humble man, and it was wonderful to watch him interact with the Holy Father.
Yeah, and I guess it was looking at some of the notes that you provided that, 60 or so dioceses had put in requests for him to come to their part of the United States, and how that all went, but that it was so beautiful how Archbishop Flores, when in Rome with the Texas bishop, had initially, I guess, extended the invitation.
That's right.
And then it went from there.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most beautiful things about it is looking back on his homily, how much he spoke about this area of the United States as being a laboratory. What were his words? A laboratory.
A laboratory for testing America's commitment to her founding moral principles and human values.
And because of the cooperation amongst the numbers of cultures and the diversity of peoples here, that we have that unique quality. And what was your? I mean, certainly, having lived here in San Antonio, you understand that very well. But how did this whole experience bring that to life and impact your understanding of, yes, San Antonio as this unique place?
Well, his words were kind of startling to me at the time, and as each year passes, I see that his words are more and more true every year, and so they resonate with me, and I think about those words often, and what he said about this community being at a crossroads between two nations, and it's something that just calls you to reflect, and you come to different ideas and different conclusions every time you think about it. And I think that's just part of the timelessness of his words 32 years ago. I mean, they apply more today than ever.
Yeah, I think between his words and through Pilgrim Center for Hope, we study a lot also the documents in the papacy of St. Paul VI, that both John Paul and Pope Paul had set things back during their papacy that we're now seeing happening, based on people's faith or lack of faith, and how that would affect what happened in the world and some of the problems that we're seeing. So, or challenges, I guess, challenges that we're seeing. So.
Yeah, it was remarkable. I mean, we all turned into pilgrims that day. Even though he came to us, we were the pilgrims for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to that article from the usher that you provided, I just wanted to read a particular quote from the perspective of that gentleman, where he said at one point, "There's no doubt in my mind, I can see the man who went to Calvary in the glowing, smiling faces, the thankful faces, the weeping faces, different colored faces, and yes, what everyone saw there." So I'm sure that to this day, that if you were there, it just burned you something into not only your mind, but into your heart and soul, to have been there in his presence. Again, even back then, not knowing that he would become a saint and would have the incredible effect on the Catholic faith and even on the world that he's had.
Well, those words give us a beautiful reflection, so I hope you get to post that on your website. It's called Reflections of a Papal Usher.
We will be doing that, most definitely. Some interesting things that you mentioned to me before the program that I think, aside from the logistics and the particulars, that impacted me more was how you mentioned, your children, for instance, were young, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids.
7 and 4.
7 and 4. I mean, what was their impression then, and now that they're adults, what do they recall of that moment?
You know, strangely enough, they don't recall a whole lot, except for one thing that my son said just recently. In one of the pictures, my son has his hand out to shake the Holy Father's hand, but the Holy Father never shook his hand, and that always stuck with my son. Instead, the Holy Father put his arms around him and hugged him. I said, well, that's much better.
Well, sure, that's what Jesus would do, right?
That's what he remembers the most. He was 4 years old, but he remembers that.
Well, and then you told a very poignant story about your father-in-law, and I think it shows you the power of someone's faith and what can come of that. If you don't mind sharing what you told me.
My father-in-law in February of '87 was told that he had 2 to 4 weeks to live. He had cancer, and this was in February. And so I said, Pop, I said, I'll tell you what. I said, I'll make a deal with you. If you live until the Holy Father comes, I'll make sure that you get a chance to meet him. And so he said, deal. And he's laying in his hospital bed, and we shook hands on it. And every once in a while, I'd remind him. And so, March came and went, and April and May. So come September, I had him out there behind that curtain that you were referring to earlier, which was our security curtain. Sure. I had him there in his wheelchair. And he got a moment with the Holy Father, and then proceeded to go to heaven right after that.
Wow.
So what a special grace to have received. And as you talked about when we started off the program, that intense desire to serve and to be involved and to help bring this all together, how, your being in that place enabled you to extend those kinds of beautiful opportunities to family. And
it was for sure a blessing.
So as we've been talking with Mr. Robert Aguirre, who was a project manager working with the Archdiocese, with Monsignor Steuben, and with Sister Charlene Wiedlich of the Sisters of Divine Providence. And I know you had another person involved as an assistant who we don't want to forget, Kathy Eck. So we'll mention her name, and of course working with Father Garcia in the Mass. But from that, you now continue to do some work with the Catholic Church or with the Vatican. Is that right?
Well, I've done a few things. I did some work working on a project for Pope Benedict that caused me to make several trips back to the Vatican and to meet with him. I've met Pope Francis a few times and scheduled to meet him again in May of next year. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, we certainly thank you for sharing your pilgrim experience and this beautiful mission that you were, set on fire for, and then was entrusted to you. And what would be sort of a final note or a final thought that you would like to leave everyone with as we, here we are in September of 2019, and now John Paul II is a saint. And so many people, I think, are right now looking for hope and looking for a sense of, what is God doing right now in my life, in our world. I wonder if you have any thoughts, be it small or otherwise, to just share with our audience about what you learned from your pilgrim experience.
Well, John Paul brought to Texas an incredible sense of joy and calmness, and I think that as Christ representative, I think we can still look to him for that same joy and that same calmness in our lives. I think that his visit was timeless, and that we can look to him today just as people looked to him 32 years ago this month, and find that same joy. And in that joy, I think we can find a unique moment of grace. We just need to take advantage of that opportunity.
Beautiful.
Very nicely said. Again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We will, after the break, we're going to continue talking about not only the visit, but also about some exciting things in relation to St. Pope John Paul II, be it a pilgrimage to Poland, and also we're going to talk a little bit more about the life of St. Pope John Paul II. So stay with us. You are listening to Journeys of Hope on the Guadalupe Radio Network. We will be right back.
Welcome back to Journeys of Hope. We have been talking about St. Pope John Paul II's visit to San Antonio in September 1987. This was the only time that a pope has visited San Antonio, and the crowd of over 350,000 people that gathered for the papal mass at Westover Hills remains a record for the largest single gathering in Texas history. This was certainly a remarkable event that lived up to the theme of unity in the work of service, as all of San Antonio, as we heard with Mr. Aguirre, came together for an apostolic pilgrim journey that went off gloriously and without incident.
And that's amazing. And one thing he didn't touch on, which we just mentioned briefly, so 3 days before the papal mass, a big gust of wind came to the site, knocked down all these 10-story scaffolds that had been the backdrop. An air traffic controller, Kelly, had managed to hear the report and get there and make sure everybody was off the scaffolding, out of the area, so no one was injured. And the fact that it happened that many days before gave people the time to clear it, to get everything in order for the Sunday Mass. And so, yes, tragedy was avoided. A miracle definitely was in there, because had there been not the warning, or had it been during the Mass, it would have been a totally different situation. So God was looking down on San Antonio for that papal visit.
Definitely. And one of the things that I'd like to reiterate is that we mentioned an article that was a reflection written by one of the papal ushers who was at the event. And it really, as I read it, it brought tears to my eyes. Just a beautiful reflection, personal reflection, giving small details that paint that picture for you. So whether or not you were there, I really encourage you, log on to our website tonight, and whenever you're listening to this, read that article. And it's never been published anywhere.
I know, so this is going to be the first time.
An exclusive.
It sees the light of day. Exactly. Reflections of a papal usher. The usher was from Bernie, but he wanted to remain anonymous because he didn't want any attention, but he just wanted to share this beautiful, it is a reflection on what he encountered, what he experienced. So, yes, come to our website, pilgrimcenterofhope.org, to find that. And thank you to Mr. Aguirre for providing that to us. You mentioned the 350,000 at the Mass. So, in between all of these official events, the Pope was traveling in the famous Pope-mobile with Archbishop Flores, and records indicate there were, all along the route, 1 million people came out, because he went through neighborhoods, went in front of the Alamo. He made sure he wanted to go to the people and to give them an opportunity, to not only see him, but he was giving blessings as he went throughout. So that certainly added to the excitement and the involvement of the whole community to get opportunities to at least see St. Pope John Paul II, if not feel that presence that Mr. Aguirre described and that we talked about earlier, that joy and that supernatural feeling of being in the presence of, yes, the representative of our Lord on this earth as the Vicar of Christ. So, yes, it was amazing to have, been in my 20s and to have been at that Mass and to then have watched all the video coverage that was provided by the media. So fortunately, there's a lot of good record of that even to this day.
Yeah, and you can definitely look that up now, thankfully, on YouTube or otherwise. Also, the itinerary for the visit, as well as the Pope's homily, which is a beautiful homily from the Westover Hills Mass, and other San Antonio talks can be found on Vatican.va website. And in addition, lots of memorabilia related to St. Pope John Paul, his visit, is either contained in the Archdiocesan archives or on display at an exhibit in the San Fernando Cathedral gift shop. So certainly you can have your own pilgrimage either to one of those places or to the official memorial, which is in Westover Hills. Over the last 32 years, the site of the Mass has seen a lot of developments. There's so much going on in that area along Petrenko Road. But a monument was placed at the site to commemorate the historic visit, and it is erected right by John Paul Stevens High School, which is actually named for a former member of the U.S. Supreme Court. But it is there, and it just is a simple but a beautiful monument that, yes, indicates that the Mass was celebrated there at that site.
And if people want to take an additional step in kind of finding out more about the papal visit, there are a number of ways. For instance, if you Google John Paul II, San Antonio visit, papal altar, it'll lead you to information about the family who constructed the altar table, the cathedra, or the papal throne that John Paul sat in, and the ambo. The ambo and the cathedra are at the archdiocese, but according to this article, the altar table was so big that it remains in the warehouse of the actual family that constructed all those things. And also the famous James Avery of James Avery Craftsman was called upon to fabricate the chalice and the ciborium and all the sacred vessels used at the Mass. And it was sterling silver on the outside. Of course, all of the inside was 14 karat gold, but that they also actually used Texas limestone as part of the chalice, and I think also worked into the ciborium to form that connection to the history of San Antonio. And also, people may know this, but all the missions were constructed from local limestone, so it even connects back to the origins and the foundation of the Catholic Church in San Antonio. So
yeah, and that's really a beautiful tradition for papal visits, that these items, these vessels, are used with, are created with various materials, and also with the craftsmen who, develop that connection and establish that connection with the visit and the community. So it is a beautiful highlight for us as a community, a faith community, but also the community of San Antonio and the wider area of Texas. And something that we can look to for that beautiful moment of hope, I think, as Mr. Aguirre so beautifully concluded our previous segment.
Yeah, I think for any Catholic, the opportunity to be in the presence of the Pope, and for a lot of San Antonians who actually got to greet him, is the answer to prayers, and also for people who are very devout, something that I think they see as a great, tremendous blessing that involves God's providence, and it just doesn't happen. So the way this all came together, yes, it gave San Antonio so much hope, and just the memory of it, I think it provides a lot of encouragement to people. And as you say now, people have different ways they can still, in relation to that visit, whether it's taking a pilgrimage to the site to see the monument, or going to the archdiocese to perhaps look at the archives, or at San Fernando. So still very much alive and very present in the hearts and minds of San Antonians.
Yes, definitely we want to direct you to continue reflecting on John Paul II, continue reflecting on his visit to San Antonio, he had, a tremendous impact and such a beautiful message for us. So we are going to give you a jewel for the journey now that you can reflect on throughout the week, and that comes from his homily, which he delivered on Sunday, September 14th at the Papal Mass in San Antonio. Robert, would you like to share that with us?
Certainly. And this was, interestingly enough, a quote that in Mr. Aguirre's article that was previously published that he provided for us, one that stood out for him as well. And we referenced it earlier, but this is the exact quote from the homily. This land, speaking of San Antonio, is a crossroads standing at the border of two great nations and experiencing both the enrichment and the complications which arise from this circumstance. You are thus a symbol and a kind of laboratory testing America's commitment to her founding moral principles and human values.
So we do invite you to look up the full homily, and it is truly relevant if you are looking for direction, for hope in this day and age.
I was going to say, before we went on, we had referred so beautifully, and Mr. Aguirre as well, when he encountered St. Pope John Paul II, what he felt, that level of joy, and as if you were in the presence, yes, of Jesus himself. I wanted to just mention one or two instances where, in preparing for the program, others who have written articles made similar comments because the words are so beautiful. So I was just going to mention that some of those comments, for instance, a person said, the light of the supernatural radiated through him and overflowed onto others in a way that could be perceived and which had a tremendous influence. And still another person said, even just seeing Pope John Paul II on television or viewing still pictures of him brought one great spiritual joy and comfort. And finally, the other one would be, we believe as to the reason why this happened. I don't know if a lot of people knew this, but the Pope John Paul had an intense prayer life, and that he would pray up to 7 hours a day and oftentimes spend 2 hours before the Blessed Sacrament. So we have come to the end of our journey today. There was so much involved. It was so exciting, but we do want to thank you all for joining us for this episode of Journeys of Hope. And because we're a pilgrim people, strive to live your journey with hope, with boldness, passion, and joy. Until next time, may God bless you. Safe travels. Journeys of Hope, a production of Pilgrim Center of Hope, guiding people to Christ. Visit our website at pilgrimcenterofhope.org.